So we might kick things off. I would firstly like to welcome everyone. As mentioned, my name's Lloyd. I'm the Communications and Marketing Manager at The Generator. I'm joined today by Jordan Thurgood from Monash University, who will be presenting today. Just firstly, I wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land we're gathered today. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future, on whoever's lands we are gathering today. So today we've got a really good webinar workshop format for you planned out. Plenty of time for questions and answers to be delivered by Jordan, but we will be using a link that I've just posted into the chat. This is Slido to answer all of your questions today, as I can see more people are coming in. This is Slido. It will allow you to ask a question at any time. You can see the questions that have been asked and upvote them if you find a particular theme coming through and want to know some more information. We do have plenty of time for questions at the end. We can see there's an issue with the link. I will quickly send out a link to that list again. But I can see we've got a few of us in here today. So thank you, Warren, for letting us know that. But without further ado, I might hand over to Jordan to introduce the session and we'll get started. Thank you, Jordan.
Hi, everybody. Let me just share my screen with you all. Okay. Good. Is that good? Can you see that there? Is that all working well? Fantastic. All right. So a lot to cover in this space. We're only going to kind of touch on it pretty quickly. I really do encourage people to ask questions in this space because it's often new for a lot of people, and the only way to really kind of upskill is to ask the questions and engage. The other thing is, if you've got the question, almost certainly someone else does in this area as well. So get those questions in and we'll try and cover as much as we can for you today. All right, so just a quick overview. What we're going to try and cover, it'll be pretty fast, it'll be at a pretty high level, but we're going to cover off intellectual property, IP, you often hear it just called IP, licensing, spin-out companies, very popular these days, so it's something people are usually pretty interested in, and then also the value beyond research, which ties into both the licensing and the spin-out companies. One of the key things that I want you to get out of today is understanding some of the options for your research, for commercializing your research. And the other thing is for you to have an understanding of where to go. I don't think we're going to answer all of your questions. I don't think you're going to get to the end of this and understand everything that you need to know, but I think this will hopefully give you an idea of where you can go to learn more, where you can learn to go to progress things. All right, so let's jump in. Intellectual property. People will just talk, as I said, people will just often talk about IP, and in the university setting, people often are referring to a patent when they're talking about IP, but there's actually many different types of IP. So there is a reason people in universities often talk about patents, and that's because it's pretty common. It's usually the main thing that we have within the university environment. However, one thing I would say is these days, there is a lot more copyright happening as well. So with the copyright, that might, for instance, be some software that is written. And so we're starting to see that there's some pretty valuable software being developed and written within universities as well. So copyright is starting to become quite an interesting sort of commercialization asset for universities as well. The other thing is designs, trademarks, trade secrets. Designs, not so common in the university setting. Usually that's done sort of closer to market, final product development sort of stages. And the other one is trademarks. Trademarks are for protecting branding. So we don't see a lot of that in the research setting itself. Again, that's kind of coming more around that sort of final commercialization stages when you're trying to build the brand. And I think there might be a talk coming up on that as well. So if you're interested, be sure to dial into that one. Trade secrets is an interesting one to cover off very quickly for you. So trade secrets is where you don't disclose what you're doing. You basically just keep it secret to your business, to your company. A good example of this is the Coke recipe. So they didn't patent Coca-Cola for very good reason. If you patent it, the world will find out about it. And so instead, what they decided to do was keep it secret. And so they managed to keep that secret for over 100 years. And so that was actually a very wise commercial strategy that they took. With IP, I think of it as an asset. So it doesn't necessarily do anything itself, but it can have value. And those who are generating it can benefit from it. So although I do consider IP to be an asset, I wouldn't think about it, if I was you with your research, I wouldn't think about it as just an asset. What I would be thinking about is your IP strategy. So you may have a patent application. That's great. That is an asset, but that is not necessarily enough in and of itself. You need to think how that's going to actually tie into the commercialization. A couple of things that I would just mention around an IP strategy: disclosure. This is probably the biggest thing for universities. If you go out there and you disclose what you're working on, that can mean that you may be ineligible to get a patent application over your technology. So what constitutes a disclosure is usually the first question that comes up. A disclosure can be anything from a publication, a conference, a poster, something published on a blog online, basically anything publicly accessible. If the patent examiners can find it, if they can see it, then that's going to be considered a public disclosure. So you need to be very careful about not just going out there and publishing all of your research, presenting it in various places without considering the IP elements of it first. So that's not to say you shouldn't publish. That's just to say you should have a think about the IP strategy behind all of this and saying, should we be getting a patent in place first and then publishing it and staging things a bit more strategically? So that's why I sort of say it's not necessarily an asset. There is inherent value in the sort of IP asset itself, but you create a lot more value when you package that into a whole IP strategy. The other thing to consider is the commercially valuable product that ends up resulting out of the research. It may actually move away from the original patent as well. And so you need to have a think about, well, what do we currently have protection on, but where do we need to keep moving? What's the area that we need to keep protecting as we go forwards? Because at the end of the day, it's really about competitive advantage. And so you need to think about what is the competitive advantage that we're getting, and the IP strategy is how you're going about achieving that competitive advantage. So it may be that an example of an IP strategy might be, well, we have a patent application that's fantastic, but once we get through to the company stage and commercializing the work, we might say, well, we need a design on this as well. We're going to build the trademark and build the branding. So you end up with, sort of a brick wall made up of many of these bricks. And so you might have multiple patents that you're putting in place. You might have copyright, trade secrets, and the patent. And so you might be sort of segregating various parts of IP in different ways. So you should think about two things, I think, in this stage. So you should assess what the various IP assets are. So you should actually look at them and assess what are these different things that we can, can we get any copyright protection over this? Can we get any patent protection over this? But then overall, what is the broad strategy to protect and exploit this IP as a collective? So IP at Monash. So if you're a Monash researcher, the IP will be owned by the university, but that doesn't mean that you don't benefit from it. The university has a revenue share policy. So this revenue share policy sees that a third of commercialization benefits will flow back to the inventors or creators of the IP. That is net commercialization revenue. What that is net of, so net is sort of, a deduction basically. And what that deduction is external costs. So that would, the most classic example of this would be patent costs. So if there's been patent expenditure, if some revenue comes in, the patent costs get deducted, and then it gets distributed 33% to the inventors and creators. The reason that happens is because it basically feeds back into the system so that we can support more inventions. We can take those patent costs that we've spent, it's gone and been successful, that's fantastic. So now we can go and take the revenue back and support some further patenting going forwards. So That's the sort of the closed loop on all of that. So you may be thinking, okay, I've got something here. I think, I've been doing this research and I think there's something, and I want to dive into, because that's a very fast overview of IP. I'm sure you'll all agree. And so you might be thinking, where do I go? What do I do next? So Monash Innovation is the central place in the university for IP and commercialization. So that is the first port of call for you. If you're generally interested in this stuff, and if you want to do some sort of upskilling yourself and background research on this, IP Australia is a great place to go. That's probably the first place I would go to. There's some good education resources there, and some of them pretty kind of like short, bite-sized little videos and things that can mean you can pick up some good little knowledge pretty quickly. One thing that I do specifically want to mention, though, is the invention disclosure form. The invention disclosure form is where you essentially register any IP that you may have created in your research or work. This website here, if you just go and Google Monash Invention Disclosure Form, this will be like the top link. Or if you go and Google Help for Monash Researchers, this will pop up. That's the page, Help for Monash Researchers. And that arrow is pointing to the invention disclosure form. So that's where you go, click on that, get the form, you can fill out the form. And that's where you basically are registering. You don't have to have finished everything. That's where you're registering. I think we've got some IP here. I would like to engage formally with Monash Innovation. I'd like this to get onto the system. I'd like to get someone allocated to help me work through our IP strategy. Can we get a patent in place for this? Maybe we can't get a patent, but is there copyright? Can we look at just getting a license deal done? So we've created some valuable IP then. Let's just say we've got to that point in the stage. We've been working with Monash Innovation around the IP strategy. Maybe we've even got a patent application happening. What happens with the IP? So we've gone and done all of this stuff, but how do we get to that kind of commercialization outcome where we see revenue flowing back in? So that's licensing. So a license is an agreement between two parties. Doesn't have to be two parties, can be more, but generally it's going to be an agreement between two parties. And what it does is it gives the rights to another party for the commercial exploitation of the IP. So the university owns the IP. University is brilliant at research. We generate a lot of really interesting, valuable IP, but we generally don't make and sell products and take products to the market. And so I've just got, a bit of a random example here, but if we invent a jet engine, we want to license that to a company who makes jet engines. They can sell it, they can maintain it. We don't want to have to get dragged into all that. We want to do more research. And so what happens is we might enter into a license agreement with the company that says, you can sell, make and exploit that IP that we've got, but you'll have to give us something back in return, of course, and that's what they call consideration. The typical thing that you will see as consideration, and you've probably heard of this in various different contexts, is a royalty. And so a royalty is a payment that is coming back in exchange for what we've given them in the license. A license agreement can and should be win-win. It should be better for both parties. And so the company that we would license should do a better job at making, selling, promoting the products than Monash would, even if we were to do it all ourselves, even if we were to kind of like have all of the revenue come through the university. Doing it with a company should be more beneficial to Monash than Monash going and doing it itself. And of course, it should be more beneficial to the company as well, because they should now have access to some really unique, valuable IP that's been built and developed in the university. So effectively, what we're trying to do is play to everyone's strengths. So we're trying to effectively say, we've got this brilliant, fantastic IP. That's what we're really good at, though, generating that. You're really good at exploiting, commercializing, developing the final product. So how do we kind of work together? And the license agreement says, well, we'll give you access to that. When you go and make a fortune out of that, you're going to provide a payment back to Monash. That's the royalty, that's the consideration. Doesn't have to be royalties, and we'll touch on that a little bit later, but that's the very common one. And so that would be the payment that would come back into the university that would then see revenue distributed to the various parties, including 33% to the inventors and creators of that IP that created that royalty. So what are some key terms with a license agreement then? The first thing that I think is important to understand is you need to understand the plan and the objectives. So you don't want to just jump into licensing something to a party and start putting all the terms on the table. First, what you want to work out is, what is everyone intending on doing? What's the plan that everyone's got here? What's the commercialization plan? How are they going to take it to market? How long is it going to take to market? What sort of business model is going to be used in taking this to market? Understanding all of that context is really important to make sure that you get the right terms in the agreement. This will help the negotiation. It'll make the negotiation easier. But it also ensures that everyone gets what they need, because you don't want to license something to a commercial party and really hamstring them so they can't actually go and commercialize it. It's in everyone's best interests that the agreement is that win-win agreement. And so by understanding what they want, what they care about is really important. And likewise for them to understand the university context. It may be the first time they've licensed from a university, or they may have done it many, many times and have a really good handle on what your university is going to care about. But you want to have those discussions first and work out what is it that we're all trying to achieve here. But jumping into some specifics for you, some interesting kind of just keywords, some key terms. So a couple of things, this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch, but a couple of interesting things that are going to have to be in there is the IP. What is the IP? What is it that we're giving them access to? We need to be specific about what they're going to have access to in there. So we have to define that in the actual agreement itself. And that will also determine their interest, right? So those first two are going to flow on very quickly, because if we give them a very limited subset of the IP that they might be interested in, they're not going to want to pay a very high royalty, because they're going to say, we have a very limited subset of IP. We need to figure out some way of getting that other IP. So those two, the royalty and the IP are very linked, but really all of the terms are going to be, they interplay with each other quite a bit. So what is the IP? What is the royalty? So that's the consideration. So what is the payment that we would expect to come back? And this really does depend on the circumstance, on the situation. What is the technology? What is the industry? What is the business model? What are the margins that we would expect them to make when they take this technology out to market? Exclusive or non-exclusive. So are we saying they are the only party that is going to get access to this license? Or are we saying you can have access to this license, but we might also license to someone else? They may be your competitor. So we might try and license it to many people. There's some complexities involved in all of that. And of course that will impact on the royalty rate. If we tell them that they have a global exclusive license to all of the IP that we might be talking about in that particular circumstance, then they're probably going to be prepared to pay a pretty reasonable royalty. But as we start to chip away at it and to kind of eat away at what they're actually getting access to, if we say it's non-exclusive, we might license to your competitor, they'll be saying, well, we can't really pay that high of a royalty if we're not getting exclusive access to this. We can't demand higher prices in the market then if we're not the only one providing it. A field restriction. So that basically means we're limiting its use. So you might have a technology, just to make up a very random example, you might have a technology that's applicable in the medical field and the aerospace field. And you might have a company that says, we would very much like to license this technology for the medical field. We are an excellent company in that field. We are the right partner for you. Let's enter into a license agreement. That all sounds fantastic, but we know that it's also applicable potentially to this aerospace field, and that company, we just know they're not going to be able to commercialize in that field. Totally different regulatory environments, totally different sales models, totally different sales teams. They're just not going to do it. And so what you can do is you can say, well, let's field restrict the medical company to the medical field. They can use this IP in the medical field, and let's go and get an aerospace company to license in the aerospace field. You can also territory restrict. So you could say, is this global? Is this for the whole world? Or do you only operate in Australia and the US? In which case, then maybe that's more appropriate that you get access to it for those markets, and we try to find someone else for the other markets. The point for a university is we want to get these technologies out there. We've done the hard yards on developing them, right? And so how do we now go and create impact in the world with them? How do we make sure that we're actually improving the world and creating the impact with these technologies? So what we want to do is, if someone can only achieve part of what we want, then we want to find someone else who can do that other complementary part. But I must also say, when we start to separate things out, you add quite a bit of complexity, and it can make it more difficult. So if you're putting in field restrictions, if you're putting in territory restrictions, you're going into a negotiation with a new partner with a very defined set of things that they can have and that they can't have. And so that does make it harder to get that next one on board. But Monash Innovation can help you with all of this. Milestones. So are there any particular milestones that we want them to achieve? Life sciences, if you've got, say, a pharmaceutical that you're developing, is a really good example of this, where there are some very critical milestones to be met along the way to getting a drug to market. There's clinical trials and very specific stages of those clinical trials. And so you might say, well, if this company takes this product, they've got exclusive license to it, and if they meet those milestones, well, actually, it is a bit more valuable as it progresses past these milestones. So we would actually expect them to make a payment back to us as we pass these milestones and as it becomes a more valuable asset. Performance obligations. So what you can also do is to say, well, we're going to license this to you, but on the condition that you meet certain performance obligations. You must be doing a good job commercializing this technology. Otherwise, we don't want it tied up with you forever. We want to pull it back out and we want to find a better partner. So that can enable you to be a little bit quicker with a partner and to say, okay, we're prepared to go and do this, but we need to set some parameters that are going to define if this is successful or not. But if you pull it off a partner and try to find another partner, there's a lot of headaches associated with that as well. So you're not aiming to do that. You're not trying to sort of maximize your dollar return by pulling it off someone and giving it to another partner. What you're trying to do is incentivize and motivate them to make sure they do the best thing for the technology, to make sure they do drive it out towards the market. Okay, so who helps you with licensing? In a word, it's Monash Innovation. So Monash Innovation will work with the lawyers from the university, OGC, the legal office, and they will work with them to ensure that the agreement, the license agreement that ends up being put in place has appropriate terms, because there's a lot of different things to cover. So they were just the key commercial terms, but there's a lot of other terms that, for instance, the lawyers will help ensure the university is protected and that there isn't inappropriate risks that are in the agreement as well. Monash does around 30 to 40 of these agreements each year. So there's a huge amount of experience in doing those each year. And so there's a lot of lessons that are learnt that are in sort of the corporate mind of Monash Innovation. And so Monash Innovation utilizes those sort of experiences to make sure when we're entering into any new license that we're calling upon the experience of all those previous ones to make sure it's the best deal possible. I would highly encourage you, if you're a researcher who is interested in this space, I would highly encourage you to be an active participant in the process. You can, in theory, say, I've done the research, hand it over, someone can go and do it from here. That makes it highly unlikely to be successful. And if you're interested in this as well, by being involved and engaged, you will learn an extraordinarily large amount. This is the kind of thing that you only really learn from actually going through and doing it, and sort of learning by actually going through the agreements and reading them and seeing them and watching how the lawyers are editing them and watching how Monash Innovation is negotiating back and forth with the partner. So I do encourage that with researchers. And one of the main reasons for it is I think it's a very interesting process. I think it's, once you actually kind of dive into it, it's actually quite interesting how it all works. But the other thing is that if you understand the process, I believe you're going to be far more likely to have future commercialization events yourself. So if you can see where this license agreement has ended up, you're going to understand in some of the other research that you're doing how that may or may not be appropriate as you're looking at that licensing pathway. And so you may think, you know what, let's think about this a little differently, because we know if we go through licensing, they're going to ask us these questions, they're going to show us on these things. Okay, how can we bring that back into our early research now and make sure we're creating the best opportunity possible? Okay, so money. People like to talk about money. People like to ask about money. So there is a fund available at the university called the Monash Research Impact Fund, the MRIF Fund. This is a fund that is managed by Monash Innovation. It's typically for up to $50,000 worth of funds. It can be extended up to $100,000 in certain special circumstances. But there are some very specific rules around this as well. And there is a very specific purpose for this fund as well. It is not a very large fund, and it is not a very large amount of funding compared to, say, some of the research funding you may have received. So it has to be very specifically tailored to high value activities. So it is not for just advancing the research. If you are looking to advance the research, this funding won't do that for you. And that scale of funding doesn't advance research a long way anyway. What this is for, it is for answering a key question that needs to be answered to get a deal over the line. So you need to have a third party who is engaged in this commercialization process, who is telling you that this is the key question that needs to be answered. To give you an example of what that might look like is, you may have a particular technology, you may be working with Monash Innovation, and you may be chatting to a number of potential licensing partners. And they may come back to you and they may say, we really, really like this. We think this is going to be good and we would like to license this off you. The only thing is, you're operating at a scale this big and we operate at a scale this big. We just think there's a lot of risk in getting from here to there. And I know you're telling us it'll scale okay, but could you just show us that rather than work at this scale, it'll also work at, this scale? And so that's where the MRIF funding can come in, where you basically go to that partner and say, is that the only question? If we show you specifically it works at that scale, and how do we define it successful and all that sort of stuff, but if we do define what success is and we achieve that success, are you telling us you will sign a deal that this is going to happen? That's the perfect scenario for MRIF funding, because what you're doing is you're basically saying, if we can answer this question, we will get a deal over the line. However, there isn't really research funding available for us to go and just do this. We can't just go and do that work without getting some sort of support. And so that's where MRIF comes in. MRIF comes in to basically say, let's bridge this final gap to get the deal across the line. As I say, though, it's managed by Monash Innovation. So when you go through the invention disclosure form process, work out your IP strategy, work out your commercialization strategy with Monash Innovation, and they will work out whether this is the kind of thing to close that final gap. But you don't want to lead with something like this. You need to try and get a deal over the line. And if the deal has a final sort of sticking point, that's when this can be really useful to get that barrier out of the way. So that's licensing. Something that we often see is that people will be sort of doing a lot of their research, and they'll get to a point where they need the next funding. They are starting to get maybe a little bit more commercial with the work, starting to get outside some traditional funding sources. A convenient answer is, let's get an investor. What I will show you is that it's probably actually not a convenient answer. It may still be a viable option, but just get ready to roll up your sleeves. So my personal view is that if you're looking at a spin-out pathway, I would always try licensing first. My thinking behind that is, why reinvent the wheel of an entire company, an entire back office, an entire sales force, an entire marketing team, all these things that the company has, the legal, the accounting, all this stuff that this company has? Why go and reinvent that wheel if they've already got it there ready to go? So if what we're bringing is the IP asset, the technology, if there is a company that this can basically just plug into and get sort of scaled up and exploited and commercialized really quickly around the world, one, they're going to be very hard to compete with if we want to start our own company. But two, it's probably financially better for everybody if we can take the technology IP and plug it in, because they can probably start making sales far sooner at a far bigger scale. And so I always would start by looking at licensing, because I think that is the appropriate thing to do. Not only that though, but if we do want to go down the spin-out pathway, you want to go and have all of those licensing discussions, and you want to understand why it is that they won't license it off you. Why is it that you can't go and close a fantastic licensing deal? So if you go and, okay, let's try and license this, they all say no, 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 no. Okay, well, let's try the spin-out pathway. I did what Jordan said. We tried the licensing. Now let's try the spin-out pathway. Actually, there's a key thing missing in that still, and that is why. Why have they all said no, 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 no? There can be some reasons they might give you that will then indicate to you, actually, they're very good reasons. This technology, this IP may not be what we think it is, and it may not be able to get all the way through to the market and create the sort of value that we think it will. Maybe we should reconsider the strategy. Maybe we shouldn't pursue this. Or they may tell you some really good insights. They won't license it, but actually the tech's really good. It might just be cannibalizing their existing business. And so you then have a very positive reason as to why you might want to spin out a company, is because it's actually fantastic. It's just they won't be the ones to do it for you. So you're going to have to go and start a new company, a spin out company, to go and drive that, because otherwise we can't license it. There isn't someone who's prepared to take that license. So we're going to license it to a spin out company and do it ourselves. The other thing is, if you go and talk to an investor, the first question they're going to ask you is, who have you spoken to? And if there are key players in your industry and you haven't spoken to them and you haven't got that feedback from them, that's going to be a big red flag for an investor, because they're going to start saying, are you prepared to get out of the building, talk to people, do the hard work? Because if you couldn't do it on the licensing stuff, you're asking me for a lot of my money. There's a risk that you're not going to work so hard with my money. It makes it challenging for the investor. If you go to the investor though, and you say, I've gone and spoken with all of these industry players and I'm pretty sure they're never going to license it because of this reason, but I also think that's not a reason for us not to pursue this. This is actually still pretty good. Then that makes it quite easy for an investor to say, you know what, if we put the money in, we can actually progress this. And maybe just one final point too, it wouldn't be uncommon for a startup company to get acquired by an existing player in the future as well. If you have an established relationship with them, if they understand what you're doing and then they see you go and deliver on that and start progressing it all, they can very quickly turn around and say, you know what, actually this was as good as they were telling us it was. We probably should look at acquiring. So it can actually help you with your spin out strategy by having those discussions at the start as well. Okay, so let's talk money on spin outs then. I mentioned that, you know, people kind of get attracted to the funding part of spin outs. So we'll start here. There is a lot of funding available these days for early stage ventures. This list here is, this is a list of people that we work with quite regularly. We've closed deals with pretty much all of them. On this page here, this is just a subset of people we work with. This is by no means, you know, an exhaustive list. This is just to give you an example. There's probably about $1 billion worth of funds on that slide there. We have very close working relationships with them. What that means is that we know what to take to them and when to take it to them. The other thing is that if you take your technology to these companies as well, they will always come back to Monash and say, we've just seen this, it's from Monash, what do we need to know? So they will always come back and close the loop too. So there is a lot of money out there. There is a lot of, as I say, this very much is just a subset as well. There's many more early stage funders available. We have relationships with pretty much all of the ones that you might want to talk to. So Monash Innovation is extremely helpful in working out not just the IP strategy, but the commercialization strategy and the investment strategy as well. What do we take to them? When do we take it to them? To give you a couple of just really quick examples, we won't spend much time on this, but just to give you a few really quick examples of some things which have happened at Monash over the last couple of years. Existing spinouts in the sort of the biotech space, and then the investors that we've worked with on those companies. So obviously quite a few happening in biotech. I won't stop on these. We can chat through sort of specific cases if people want examples and things like that. Physical sciences, engineering type companies, a number of them there as well. A couple of these recently ASX listed as well. So some good kind of success stories coming along there. And generator startup type companies as well. A lot of interest in this space too. A lot of funding coming into this area as well these days. And I'll touch on the generator and Monash Innovation and how you can leverage both of them to your advantage. Okay, so we're excited about spinning out a company now. We have seen that others have done it before in those examples there, and we've seen that there's a lot of investors out there who are prepared to put the funding in. So this is all sounding pretty good, right? So how do we do it? Let's see how we go and do it. So for me, this picture here is this sort of like timeline here is a pretty common view of spinning out from the university. So we're doing this researching, patenting type stuff. As I said, it doesn't have to be patenting, but we're doing this kind of like, I probably should be IP there. So doing this research, we're building this IP asset and the IP strategy, and then we're going into this spin out company phase. And so what we're probably going to have to do is a whole bunch of pitching. So we're probably going to start pitching this technology to a whole bunch of investors. Monash Innovation can help you with template pitch decks, refining the pitch deck, just working out, who we're presenting it to, what we need to present to them. but there's going to be a lot of activity around this pitching, right? We're going to have a lot of discussions with people to work out, are they prepared to invest? They're not going to just meet you and say, here's the check, that was brilliant, you've won us over. They're going to want to meet you. They're going to want to think about it. They're going to want to go and talk to people they know in the industry. Again, why it's good if you've gone and had those discussions. And then they might come back. They might have a bit more discussion. They might want to refine your plan. But eventually, we'll hopefully get some investor interest. Eventually, at some point, we'll get the investors saying, you know what? We think we like this. We think we want to do a deal. Let's move ahead. Let's start working this out. And then you've got this phase at the end where you're closing the deal, right? You're working out the terms of the deal. You're working out the company structure. This can take months and months and months. So this is not a very quick thing to turn around. It takes a lot of effort. It is a lot of effort to start a company. There's a lot of interesting things happening in that time, and you'll learn a lot throughout that time, but it is not straightforward. But so that is kind of that sort of, we're in research land, and the goal is to spin out a company. So that's what the goal looks like. And at the end of that, we've closed a deal, we've got some funding, we've got a company, we've got a license for the IP into that company. Fantastic. That's great. But I would like to present to you a slightly different view of this as well, which is from, say, the company's perspective or the investor's perspective. And that purple bit is now going to look about that big at the start. And so we've gone and done all of that work. We've established the company. We've got the license agreement. What does this look like going forwards from then? So this is now kind of, day one for the company. This is the start of it all. So what this is kind of like typical funding rounds. It's just typical. It's an example. This is not a hard rule by any means, but this would not be uncommon. And I want to just give you a bit of an overview of, what's sort of coming up. So these different phases here to talk them through really quickly. So we've got that bit at the start, that's spinning out. So great, we're out of university, we've got a company. And really what that does is that's kind of your pre-seed funding often, not always, but often. Your pre-seed funding might be something like $250,000, 12 months worth of activity that you're going to go and do. And at the end of that, we're going to go and raise some seed funding. Maybe that's going to be like $1 million now, maybe about 18 months worth of runway, like activity or like runway for how long the company can operate. At the end of that, maybe like a Series A, call it $3 to $5 million, 2 years runway. And at the end of that, Series B, maybe ASX listing, whatever it is going on. So, so spinning out is actually kind of the start of the journey from a company investor perspective. So you might be getting there thinking like, great, we've crossed the finish line, but you need to be prepared that all of the stakeholders around you are probably actually going to look at it as great, we've just started. And so it can be quite exhausting to get to that stage, but you need to know there's a lot of work ahead to come as well. So I also want to show you this so you can start to just see what's coming ahead. So you can start to sort of plan beyond just spinning out. People often have visibility of, okay, I want to spin out, but actually let's have some visibility about what happens after we spin out as well. You also need to think about the milestones. So you're going to go and raise funding at these different stages, for instance. As you go and raise funding, you're going to have a milestone, or you're ideally going to have a milestone that you're going to have achieved in that prior round. That means, one, you will close the funding because you've gone and done something fantastic. Great, you'll close the funding, but also two, you've now created this like value inflection. And so you can now raise more money at a higher valuation because you've gone and achieved something pretty special. There's that milestone that you've ticked off. So it's a bit of ongoing effort for this fundraising. So it's not just a case of we've spun out the company, we've got an investor, so they'll just be paying for all of the research work we need to do now. Very much not the case. So what does this kind of look like? So I'll try and put a little bit more detail against this then. And so this is not all of the activities. This is just sort of like what we had before, like pitching and then kind of closing the deal. So you're going to kind of do that for every round. So you're going to want this milestone to be happening so that you're going and pitching saying like, we did this milestone. It's far less risky now. It's far more valuable now. Therefore, you should invest, and you should invest at a higher valuation. You might need to go and find different investors at these stages as well. Some people like to invest very early and small amounts of money. Some people like to invest a little bit later and very large amounts of money. And so you may have a bit of a transition across this as well. It's not necessarily one investor going the whole way. Brilliant if you can have that, but not necessarily going to be the case. So there's a lot of activity going on here. There's a lot of hard work in what those kind of arrows represent. And these outcomes can often be sort of like like binary, basically, like you have to pass, you have to get funding, you have to keep going. And so it's not a case of, oh, okay, just didn't quite work. Well, let's just keep going and then we'll come back to it later. It's often a case of like, no, the clock is ticking, you're spending money, you've got staff, you're paying patent costs, and you really need to get more funding in. And so you can have some pretty hard deadlines on these sorts of things. And so it can mean that you really have to work hard because you have to close these funding rounds. So it can be a lot of work actually getting all these rounds lined up. So I guess one of the points that this for me is leading into is that a spin-out founder needs to focus on so much more than just the technology. If you are going to be a spin-out founder, if that's the pathway that you end up choosing to go down, there's a lot more than just let's make great tech and it'll be worth something. So this comes back, I mean, it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but, you know, to a bit of a silly sense really, but, you know, so I've got a patent, when does the check arrive? You know, when do I get the money? Of course, that's not the case at all. What we've just spoke about before was like capital raising activity. So there's going to be this intensive capital raising activity that you're probably going to have to go and do. That is going to pull you away from the technology. That is going to pull you away from the product development. That is going to, the company's probably already getting away from core fundamental research into more commercial product development, regulatory type work. But even that stuff, you're going to get pulled away from to go and do capital raising activities. So what this leads to is that the team is really important. So investors are aware of all of the work that's involved with this. And so they look at this and they say, can you build a team around you? Because you're going to need a team around you. You need to think beyond the technical. So who will bring the commercial strategic value? Who will do the business development and sales activities? Who's going to do all the legal work, the HR work? Who's going to do all that capital raising, investor management work? These things all sound very easy. And it sounds like the technology is the hard part, but I can assure you there's many founders that I can introduce you to that have essentially become HR managers, that basically the core value of their business is driven by the talent they can attract into the business and then retain in the business. They're like just constantly recruiting, constantly trying to get, because there's so much that has to get done. They just constantly need to be bringing the best people in and trying to look after them to make sure they stay. The other thing that I would say that's very common in that kind of team environment is sort of your business development, sales lead type roles. There is often a resetting of expectations very quickly where around sort of like salaries and costs for that as well. So often that is seen as something that can just be like bolted on afterwards. It's like, well, we'll just go and hire someone, they'll go and do that. There's actually quite a lot of work involved in building the sales strategy around this and how it's all going to work. And those people will charge more money than you probably are expecting if you're a very technical person. All of that though is a risk. And so you need to build a team around this to make sure that you can minimize those risks to make it far easier for an investor to come on board, that they've got more confidence that he's not going to fall into a heap, that there are enough capable, experienced people in this to make sure everything gets done. So one of the key points for me on that then is that an easy sort of saying to remember around this is that sort of like the technology and the IP, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You absolutely do need to have your technology and IP, and it really should be good. It really should be very solid and very valuable in and of itself, but that's not it. You don't just get to sort of stop there and go, okay, great, technology's worth something. We'll presumably just be getting some value coming in. Everything else will solve itself. Okay, so essentially spin-outs, they're hard work. There's a huge amount of things beyond the research, obviously, which is required to have a successful spin-out company. The other key points that I would say in sort of wrapping up a lot of this, and we'll jump into questions pretty soon, but the other key thing that I would say is that spin-outs are not the answer to every and even most research commercialization activities. So a spin-out does involve a license. You're just licensing from the university to the company instead of to say a third company. But licensing is far more common than spinning out technologies. And that's because of the things that we've discussed earlier. Start with the licensing, find a partner, don't reinvent the wheel, see someone who's already got it, more beneficial, win-win for everybody. If that's not the case, okay, let's look at the spin-out pathway. And then there are certain situations where it is just more, it leans itself to a spin-out pathway. We have this really strong team. We have this good capability. We're going to go and do this. Then maybe the one of the other things to leave with you is that they are really challenging, but you do learn a lot really, really fast. So if you are the type of person that is very interested in learning all of this stuff, jumping in and challenge, you actually kind of like enjoy that hard work element because it's something new, it's a new experience, then spin-outs start to become pretty interesting for you, I would say. If you are thinking though, I just want to do the world's best research, I just want to create the next piece of IP, that's where I want to focus. There are ways you can still do a spin-out like that, but you would probably separate yourself from the company. But otherwise, licensing starts to look pretty attractive, right? If that's your core strengths and capabilities, licensing starts to look pretty good. So where do you go? This, just one final thing for you then is, I would say there's two places for you. If you're interested in the entrepreneurship side of it all, the Generator, that's the co-working space at the Generator. Obviously, we can't all be in there at the moment, but that is a great place to be in and around. The Generator runs a lot of programs. There's a lot of different things to engage with and to be involved with, but also just being in the Generator is really important. You're going to start to mix with a lot of people that you don't mix when you're within your faculty or department or whatever. You're going to be mixing with people doing entrepreneurial things from all over the university. And so you're going to have different conversations, and they're going to be really high value conversations if you're interested in commercializing, in particular in entrepreneurship. The other place, of course, Monash Innovation. So if you're interested in that kind of IP licensing, spinning out a company, Monash Innovation, that's your first port of call. And then one final thing I would say is they are not mutually exclusive either. You don't need to sort of pick one or the other. I would actually encourage you to look at both. So if you are spinning out a company, obviously you'd start with the IP, start with Monash Innovation. But if you're thinking, you know, I actually have a bit of interest in this kind of spin out pathway stuff, then actually you should go and engage with the Generator. You should be involved down there as well. And so doing both becomes quite complementary and increases, I think, your chances of success. All right, so I might leave it there and see how we're going for time. Yeah, I might leave it there then, and we can jump into some questions. I'll stop sharing. Cool.
Thank you, Jordan. Yeah, let's jump into some questions now. I can see there's plenty that have been submitted throughout the course of today via Slido. We might answer them as they've been voted up. Yep. Can you see that, Jordan? So the first question, can I work at Monash and be CEO of a spin-out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a kind of a couple of ways to sort of come about answering that, but in theory, yes, but in practice, no, would be my answer to that. So in theory, you can do that, and there are some situations where you can make that work, but where I would say that really falls apart is from the company side of things. The company needs to have a CEO who is focused on the company, the commercialization. They get up in the morning and they think about the company. They go to bed at night, they think about the company. Like, that is the thing that's on their mind. So the problem that I think you will have when you try to look at splitting things like that is there isn't someone who is driving it. There isn't someone who is basically just saying, like, we're going to do this, we're going to make this happen. There's also then a bunch of work that needs to be done in terms of conflict of interests, managing things from both the company side and the university side as well. So it is possible, it is doable to manage all those conflicts of interests. But if you're going to spin out a company, then I would look at it and say, who is going to be driving this business? If you're not prepared to jump into the business, is there someone else who is? And so at the end of the day, for me, I would want to look at a company and say, is there someone who's just owning this, who is just ultimately responsible, and that there isn't other things pulling them, distracting them? And then the final thing, of course, is there's going to be typically an investor, and the investor is going to look at this and say, like, great, you've got your research stuff, fantastic. I'm here for the company. What's best for the company? Is you doing other stuff best for the company? And, you know, we'll invest based on who's going into this company. As I said, there's a lot of work that has to happen. And so if you have people kind of like with split attention, it becomes pretty hard pretty quick. Yeah. But so in theory, possible, there are certain circumstances where it might work, but But in practice, I think you've really got to have someone who's driving the business. If there's not a clear CEO taking ownership and responsibility for that business, it is very hard to outcompete other people who do. So next one was, I have IP that can't be patented. I have a health intervention for children with disability. How would I go about licensing an approach rather than a technology? Okay, so if there isn't a patent, that isn't the end of the story. That doesn't mean it's not possible. It means you want to have a chat with Monash Innovation, because what you want to do is you want to look at an IP strategy. Is there something in copyright? Is there some software that we have that might be worth licensing out? Is there some documentation around like the program itself and how that actually works that you might license out? And so that's the sort of content and material that you could license out. So that could be the type of thing that you do. But you also need to have a look and think about who's licensing it. What are their alternatives as well? Because if you go to them and you say, oh, we want to license this and we want you to pay a very large amount of money to us to commercialize this technology, they will also look at it and say, do we need to license that? You know, that sounds like they're going to try and charge us a lot of money. Do we really need to license that technology? And so they will assess their alternatives. If what you're doing is licensing software, they'll say, can we create that software ourselves internally? And it'll probably be a build versus buy question. We can go into that license and that's going to cost us X. We can build it internally for Y. Is X less than Y? Do the deal, don't do the deal. The other thing that can be useful in that discussion with the partner is timeframes and timelines. So it may in fact be that they could build it cheaper internally, or maybe it's not even cheaper, but you know, kind of on par, and then they get to keep all the know-how and trade secrets internal to their business because they've built it. But maybe you can get them to market faster. Maybe what you've done has taken quite a lot of years to get to that point. And yes, they could look at it and try and rebuild it themselves, and that there isn't any particular registered IP that's going to stop them from doing that. But maybe what you're selling them is a leg up, a head start. So maybe what you can sell them is getting to the market quicker. Maybe they will get an extra 2 years of commercial revenue at the start. So that's the sort of angle that you can take with them as well. But at the end of the day, that's why I also say it's about the IP strategy, not about just the asset itself. If you don't have that, a patent makes it a little bit easier to rely on an asset. But if you don't have that clear patent, then the strategy becomes ultra important. Cool. All right.
I love this next question. What is the differences between spin-out and startups in the Monash context?
Okay, that's actually a really good question. I like that myself. I would upvote that one myself. So a spin-out is generally a startup company. A startup is kind of like a new company, a fledgling company that's getting started. And typically what we talk about as well is it's like a high growth company. So if I go and open the milk bar on the corner, yes, it's a new business, so it kind of ticks that box, but it's not really a high growth business. It's not likely to become Google or Facebook or Afterpay or something like that. So that's generally considered, you know, a small business, whereas a startup is often considered, it's a new and a high growth business. So then the spin out. So what is the spin out then, if that's what a startup is? So the spin out is where you've basically created that startup from the university. And so you've done the research, you've got some IP that's been created within the university, and that startup company exists to commercialize that IP. And so if you are a spin out company, you are almost certainly a startup company. If you are a startup company, you are not necessarily a spin out company. But if you are a researcher, you've, for instance, just to keep it as simple as possible, you've created some IP, Monash has filed a patent over that, you've got an investor, you've started a company, licensed that IP into this company, and it's going to take that technology to market, that would be considered a spin out company.
Great stuff. And also probably a really good follow-up question. Do you need to have IP to spin out a company from Monash?
Yeah, that is a good follow-up. So generally, yes, because what you're doing is you're saying when you're creating this startup company at the start, you need to work out what are the contributions everyone's putting into that. And so, for instance, the investor is pretty straightforward. They're putting in dollars. So if they put in $1 million, we get to say, well, you get $1 million worth of shares. That's a pretty nice, straightforward transaction. What's the university putting into the company is kind of the question. And so, okay, typically a license for the IP. So we put the license to the IP, then that company can go and take that $1 million to go and commercialize that IP. It's got what it needs. That's a nice spin out company, and off it goes. Now, if we don't have IP, there are actually a couple of examples of where there isn't yet IP created, but there is some very strong capability, experience, and then like a plan that gets built at the university around more an opportunity than an existing asset. And so that is a little bit of a different model. It's not common, but it is possible. If that's the case, I would say you're definitely wanting to have a chat to Monash Innovation about that. The key thing for that situation is the investor. The key thing is because a big question investors going to have is, if I'm putting this money in and we don't have the IP, we just think we're going to create the IP, that's a risk. And so only certain investors are prepared to take on a risk like that. So there's very rarely like very hard and fast rules in this place. There's usually kind of like, we need to be very flexible. We need to work around a lot of things. Generally, I would say, yes, you need to have IP to spin out a company. But to be clear, there absolutely are exceptions to that as well. And so you don't need to think, because we don't have IP, there is nothing for us to do, but you do need something. So there needs to be a strategy, a plan, something has to go into that company. So, yeah.
Sorry, Jordan, next question, probably a good example to work through. As a company licensing, can you have different amounts paid to Monash? The example suggested maybe 2% until you make $1 million, then 10% for after that, for example.
Yes, yes, you can. And so this can be for any company licensing. So you can have sliding royalties. This is again where it comes back to the plan and the context. So what is it that everyone's trying to achieve here? Because understanding that means that, for instance, you could be flexible on how you are structuring those royalties as well. So you may know that there is certain activities and things that are coming up for a company. And so you don't want to necessarily harm them at certain stages by charging too much of a royalty. But by the same token, you might also know that actually it's something kind of very good in the future. It can slide either way as well. And it really depends on the context of what's the business doing? Why is it appropriate to have some sliding or staged kind of royalties? Like, why is that more appropriate than just having a fixed number royalty? One thing I should probably mention here as well, which it may come up, but a royalty is based on the net sales, like the revenue that a business makes. It's not on the profit. The reason being that profit can effectively be manipulated by a company in terms of, adding in additional costs and how they account for various things. Like an accounting process can kind of take care of most of your profit if need be. So if you have a royalty on a profit, it's quite easy for a company to minimize the amount of royalties they pay by how they structure their books. By having it on net sales revenue type top line sort of metrics, it's much harder for a company to do that because the company wants to make sales. The company wants to get out there, and it's just a share of that comes back through to the university. So that's what the percentage is usually applied to, not a profit, but a sales revenue type metric. But yeah, to answer the question, you can absolutely have flexibility in how you calculate the royalty at various stages.
Awesome, thanks. Very clear. If we have all the IP identified, we want a license from Monash, how long does it take to have the green light?
That's good. This doesn't have a clear answer at all. It depends an extraordinarily large amount on the circumstance. So it can be very quick. You can take a very simple license agreement from a university to get access to technology. But traditionally, that's not the case, because traditionally there is a lot of stuff to be worked out.
probably a few questions here on timeframes as well. What is the timeframe for a PhD student to proceed attempting to commercialise their research after the degree is granted?
Can you hear me now?
Sorry. Yes. Yes.
Cool. Headphones, of course, decided to die. So just let me know if the audio gets bad at any stage.
All good.
So how long does it take? So it can be very quick, but there's usually a lot of stuff to work out as we've discussed, as we've kind of covered off. So you're going to have to work out, well, who is, the investor that's coming in? What is the plan that's going to them? What's the team look like? Who's going into the company? So if you're spinning out, there's all those sorts of things that you're going to want to look at. If you're licensing directly to a third party, like just an existing company, then a lot of that is kind of answered. They're going to do all of that. And so you just need to work out those details, what are the kind of head terms, the commercial terms that we're going to look at, and then what are the other terms from there. So typically it's going to be on the order of months usually, but it's going to depend a lot on the negotiation. If you have a very strong, clear piece of IP, then it's very easy for them to assess if they want that IP. So that makes the due diligence around the technology very quick. Otherwise, their due diligence can take quite a long time. And of course, their due diligence is going to impact on what they're prepared to pay in, say, the royalty. They need to work out their commercialization plan. So do they need this to be global? Do they need exclusivity? So so the license itself is actually not the bulk of the time. It's working out the context and the plan and what everyone's going to do. That takes a lot of time, but you want to get it right. You want to spend the time to actually make sure you're getting that stuff correct, because you don't want to have to fix things in the future. You don't want to have to go back, and you don't want the technology to not be commercialized appropriately. And so you're far better off making sure it's all correct at the start. Everybody's appropriately incentivized and aligned, and everyone has what they need to get out of it as well. So it is a big spectrum from very fast to very long, and it basically depends mainly on the context of your situation.
Awesome, thank you. Well, there's probably another couple of questions around timeframes here. So timeframe for a PhD student to proceed attempting to commercialise their research. How long does it take to get a patent? I'm wondering if we can answer a few of these time-based questions.
Yeah, so what was the first one there? What is the time frame for a PhD student to proceed attempting to commercialise their research after the degree is granted? Okay, so I am maybe an interesting case in this myself. So I spun out a company from Monash whilst I was doing my PhD with a couple of other people. I did that before I'd finished my PhD. So the answer to that question is, what is the time frame for when they can do this once they've finished their PhD, once they've had it granted? You don't have to have finished your PhD to do that. However, from my experience, what I would say is if you're going to do that, you would want to probably go and finish that PhD as quickly as possible. Because if you're spinning out a company, you've probably got some pretty interesting research you've got some interesting IP, you've probably got the sort of information you need to write up your PhD. Maybe you can get that finished pretty quickly and then move on to the company side of things. But it's not mandatory. And so it's probably going to be pretty useful, though, if you're going into that company to be able to say, I've got my PhD, did that at Monash, this has come out of that, and move on. But there's no hard sort of time frame or rules around when you can do it. But I would certainly encourage anyone who is in that position that I was in so to give you an example, my theory was I will go and do the company part-time and I'll do the PhD part-time. I would be very surprised if anyone can really do that. It's very, very hard to work on the PhD once you've got the startup company. It's going to consume all of your attention and your time, and it's going to be pretty damn fun at the same time. So it's very hard to, write up the thesis, get that stuff done once you're in the throes of it all. I really would encourage you to work really hard, get it done, get it out, and jump into the company.
Awesome, thank you. Another time-based questions. How long would it take to get a royalty fee back once a deal is done? On average, once off, paid over time?
Yes. So, okay, there's actually a couple of things in there. I don't really have a good answer for you in terms of like on average. It's really, really case dependent. It's going to basically depend on that commercialization activity. When do they get that to market? Now, there are a couple of things that you can actually put into a license agreement that might mean a royalty is coming back before they've even commercialized it in the market. So you could put some things into a license agreement like minimum annual royalties. So this would be saying every year you must pay us a royalty of X dollars. And that is to encourage them to make sure that they are actively pursuing the technology. And if they are not commercializing it, they must keep paying at least that amount of money each year. So that can happen kind of, from the start. But in terms of like, the proper royalties coming back from commercial activity, it depends when the technology gets commercialized. This is also why it's really important to have the right partner that you're licensing to, because you want someone who is capable of taking the product to the market as fast as possible and to do as good a job of it as possible, because that's what's going to impact on when, but also if you're going to get any royalty at all, but when that is going to start coming in. The other thing that I would say that is it once off or paid over time, that can be put into the agreement as to the timing of payments. It would be common to say at least annually. So every year they're going to do their finances and they're going to say, this is the revenue we made off this product line. Therefore, we owe you Y percentage of that revenue. And then here's the check for that. And so annual would be common, but you can also do things like quarterly and stuff like that as well. Again, all comes down to what goes in the agreement.
Nice one. Can I have shares in a company if I am staying in my role at Monash?
Yes, you can. That also comes a little bit back to that CEO question. So one thing that you can do, for instance, is you may end up as, say, a founder of a business, but you might determine, say, if we've got a founding team of, say, like 2 people, we might have like a professor and a postdoc or a PhD. And the PhD, it might be their project, the one that they've worked on, it's the only thing they've worked on, and they kind of say, you know what, I'm prepared to jump out, I'll go into the company, I was going to have to look for a job anyway, I love this thing, this is my life, let's jump into the company, I'll go and do that. I was on a PhD scholarship, so I'm prepared to take a crappy startup salary anyway. They go and jump in, and you might have, say, a professor who says, you know what, I have many projects, I have a lot of research, I have more research to give, that's my value. I'm going to be maybe like on the scientific advisory board of the company, but I'm actually going to keep my job at Monash. So in that situation, a very hypothetical situation, of course, but in that situation, you may have that professor getting some sort of shares in relation to their role on scientific advisory board. They can have the shares and keep their job at Monash. However, that of course triggers off a lot of conflict of interest matters. So it means that you're going to have to make sure you've got a very solid conflict of interest plan in place. You're going to need to review it regularly. You're going to need to keep it up to date. And you need to make sure that everybody around you is aware of those activities as well. One thing that I tell founders that are involved in startup companies is you need to have a really, really high bar for your conflict of interest management plan, because if it is successful, if the company goes on to be very successful, that is when you'll have people approach, you or your boss or whoever and raise issues. If it's not successful, no one will care. You'll never hear about it because there's nothing to fight over anyway. So if you go and have a very sloppy conflict of interest management plan that just manages to get past all of the people that are required to sign off on it, you're leaving yourself exposed for someone to have a perception that things weren't right. And it's the perception that I think is going to be the biggest risk for you as a founder. And so I tell people that you really should put a lot of effort in making sure your conflict of interest, it's up to date and it is really solid and it is well communicated to people, because that makes it very clear for other people, one, to raise some issues early if they see any issues, but also two, if someone says to you, hang on, things aren't done right, all of the people involved can say, well, we can have a look at the management plan because we've all worked on putting this management plan in place. So if you are in that situation, it is extremely important that you own yourself the conflict of interest management plans. Don't think of it as an administrative task that you just have to kind of get done, and only if someone reminds you you need to get it done. Consider this the reminder now. If you're going to be a founder of a company, if you're going to have shares in the company, you have to make sure you have your conflict of interest plans done, up to date, and they should be very high quality conflict of interest management plans.
Great stuff. Quick hello to everyone joining us from Malaysia today. Interesting question. Can Malaysian researchers tap into MRIF?
That's a really interesting question. I'm actually not sure that the hard answer to that. So it's available to kind of like Monash IP and Monash researchers. So presumably, if that's the situation, then yes. But I might actually have a look into that for you and just confirm. I think that would be the case. I'll confirm, and we can maybe send something to you. Maybe what I would say on that then is chat to Monash Innovation, and that's how we can just make sure. If you're not sure, reach out, have the discussion, have the conversation.
Okay, here's another interesting one. If I've chosen to treat my invention as a trade secret, if someone else then discovers my secret, can they patent it as their invention and deny me use?
Yeah, this is great. This is a really interesting one. So this will come down to, so when you're going for a patent, a couple of things that you're going to need to do, and this would be, you're kind of the other person in this case. So when you're trying to get a patent, you're going to need to prove that it's novel, that it's new. And so you need to be able to show that it doesn't really exist, it hasn't been out there. And so if, for instance, they are trying to file a patent on the work that you've been doing, and you've put some information somewhere online, when they're going through their examination process, you would be able to point to that and tell the examiner, actually, they shouldn't really be allowed their patent because they're going to fail novelty. Because if you look at, say, this website over here, it actually documents what they're doing. So you can actually prevent them from getting the patent if you've got that in place. But one thing that you should be very nervous of, or very kind of not nervous is probably the wrong word, but you should be very conscious of, is if you are using trade secrets as your approach, keeping them secret is the value. And so the strategy around that is, how do you make sure that only the people that need to know about it? How do you make sure you don't have the IP leaking out of your company? How do you make sure that others can't go and reverse engineer your product? And so that's the sorts of stuff that you're going to have to start doing as your kind of IP strategy then, is how do you make sure that a staff member doesn't leave and go and work somewhere else? So they're the types of things that you're going to, so you can, in theory, prevent someone from patenting if you've got stuff publicly disclosed online, but you need to be careful that you don't educate the market, of course, as well. But also then you need to start thinking about, well, with this IP strategy, how are we ensuring these trade secrets are kept secret? Because if a competitor does that, I would say the most likely reason that they're doing that is because they've got access to your information somehow. Somehow you've had IP leak out of your company. And so the key to that is probably making sure you've got really good processes, really good structures in place. You hear all these stories, I don't even know if they're true or not, but you hear these stories about, only a handful of people at Coke would ever know the whole process and recipe, and that they would never be allowed to be on the same plane at the same time and that sort of stuff. So, I don't know if any of that's true or not, but it's that type of activity of like, how do you segregate and how do you control and how do you protect information?
Nice one. We might do a couple at once here. It's a good one, good general one. How long does it take to get a patent? And how do I know if I can get one?
Yeah, so how do you know if you can get one? The best thing to do is chat to Monash Innovation, because they're very experienced at getting many, many patents through the patent system. And so, obviously work with university technologies. So chat to Monash Innovation, they can help you work out, can I get a patent? But also the really valuable question as well is like, should I be getting a patent right now? Like, how does this fit into that IP strategy? So there is that technical question of, can I get a patent? But you also, Monash Innovation will work with you on, should we be doing this? Is there, okay, we could file a patent, but should we? The other one, how long does it take to get a patent? So I might even just share screen again really quickly. I can show you a slide. I suspected someone would care about how long it takes to get a patent. So let me just share this with you. Can you see that okay? Is that popped up? Great. So this is just an image taken off the internet, but it's just to kind of show you the various stages in the patent timeline. I mean, the first thing that you'll take out of this is a lot happens. There's a lot going on. You don't just like file the patent, wait, get sent a letter saying you've got grant. But to highlight a couple of things here, you've got kind of, you know, conception at the start, reduction to practice, which is kind of like actually making it. And then right at the start here, you can ignore the initial public disclosure, but basically you should be filing before that initial public disclosure. We then have this kind of 1 year period where this is called a provisional patent down the bottom. So that's a 1 year period there. We then enter PCT, that's 18 months. So we're already up to 30 months by the end of that. That window, by the way, the university won't support patents beyond that. If we've had 30 months to try and find a partner to try and commercialize this and we can't, that is the time frame that we start to say it's probably worth us not spending, which is a very large amount of money at national phase. We're probably better off not spending a very large amount of money there. We're probably better off funding many, many more projects back at the start. But so 30 months, we're at national phase. After national phase, we start to enter this kind of like examination period, and that is on a country by country basis. So the US will do it when the US is ready to do it. Australia will do it when Australia is ready to do it. Europe will do it when Europe's ready to do it. So they all operate on different time frames. So you don't know exactly when you're going to get examined. After you've been examined, but it could be a couple of years. It might take a couple of years before it actually goes through examination. And so by this stage, you're actually, you know, maybe 3-4 years after you filed the patent before you go through examination. If you pass examination, then you can get a granted patent. And that is the point in time at which you can say, I have got a patent. It's granted in maybe the US. It's granted in Australia. I've got a patent in Australia. I've got a granted patent in the US. And so, you know, it's years is the answer to that. And there's many steps along the way. The first steps are very well defined. 1 year for a provisional, 18 months for a PCT, and then you enter examination, and then it gets a bit vague. It's going to be maybe a couple of years from there. Doesn't always have to be that way as well, I'll say. One thing with patenting is it's always sounds like there's all these hard rules and there's always exceptions. You really need to have professionals who understand it because there's always subtle nuances as well. I'll just stop sharing that one.
A good follow-up question, is a company worth more to an investor if they have a patent?
Is a company worth more to an investor if they have a patent? There's almost like a simple answer that's kind of like, yes, you've got a patent, it's worth more, of course. But in reality, it's never going to be that simple. In reality, the question is going to be, well, what does your patent protect? You know, what countries is that patent granted in? And so there is a big spectrum of how valuable a patent might actually be. If I have a granted patent on something which is actually quite useless, it's very, very specific, there's a lot of ways that I could do sort of alternative things to get around it, it's probably not that valuable. And so an investor may look at that and say, great, you've got a patent, but we don't see the company making any money off that patent, and we're going to have to spend a couple $100,000 on this patent over the next few years. That would maybe be a negative thing to a company, right? That's actually a burden on the company. It's not the right piece of IP in that company. But presumably we're not creating these patents. And if you're working with Monash Innovation, they will make sure that what you're looking to put into a patent application is actually valuable, that it is actually something that's useful and valuable. So that is part of the reason why investors, for instance, will like to come to a university and come to Monash Innovation and say, what have you got? Is because there's this sort of trust with Monash Innovation that the IP, the patents that are being filed through Monash Innovation are of value, so that we don't have this situation of, this is really not a very valuable patent, but we're going to try and lob it on you anyway. So if you're spinning out from, say, the university, then generally, yes, they would say that there is some value ascribed to that patent. But as I say, it really just depends on the patent, and it depends on what the company's strategy is, what the company's plans are. Again, it comes back to this, this IP strategy piece. If the company's never going to commercialize that IP, it's probably not worth paying for it. It's probably not worth losing the attention on it. So In theory, the answer is yes, but I think in practice, the answer is it depends. What is the patent you're talking about? What's the company plan you're talking about?
We are getting close to time, so we might just try and get through a few quick fire questions to finish up. So what is Monash's involvement in spin-out companies? Does MI take a stake apart from IP consideration, for instance? I guess what's the involvement?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that Monash does these days to try and support commercialization activities in general, but so in particular to startup companies, it's a lot of this stuff that we talk about around the strategy, right? So making sure what is the patent, how does the patent fit into the IP strategy, what is the commercialization strategy around that? When it comes to spinning out, who are the investors, going and bringing those investors in, because usually they're from our networks. A lot of discussions with the investors behind the scenes as well about like, how do we make this work? How can we pull this all together? A bunch of work around then setting up the company. So has the company got the right shareholders agreement, constitution, subscription agreement? So a lot of work in negotiating all of that sort of stuff. Beyond that, once the company's up and running, there are a couple other things that university can do in certain circumstances as well. University may take shares in a company as opposed to a royalty to help out the company, to basically say, okay, if we don't want, if an investor's putting cash into a company, it's pretty common these days for investors to say, I'm putting cash in, why is money going out the other door? And so they would prefer the university be an equity holder than taking a royalty. The university, Monash is prepared and able to do that. The other thing is funding. So the university can provide funding to the companies in certain circumstances as well. And also governance and oversight too. So the university does also, in certain circumstances, it can put a director on the company board as well. And so that doesn't cost the company anything. That's just to make sure the company's got the right governance, the right management. So there's a whole bunch of things around that. And then there's sort of ongoing access to, say, like the generator, the co-working space, the image behind Lloyd there, ongoing access to Monash Innovation, people like myself as well. So it's kind of a whole suite of things, to be honest.
Maybe just another follow-up to that about Monash Innovation and connecting with Monash Innovation. If someone, for instance, has a trade secret or something with capacity to be patented, how would they know that this conversation will be private, held in confidence, etc.?
Yes. So Monash Innovation, we all have confidentiality under our employment agreements. So you can disclose, and you actually do need to disclose to Monash Innovation what the invention is. So you don't have any issues with disclosure talking to Monash Innovation. So that's contractually, that's the case. But the other thing as well is then just, well, how do I know that you're not going to go and just tell everyone about it? And at the end of the day, Monash Innovation is built on its reputation. And so we need to get these technologies out there to the right places. We need to work with the researchers and the inventors on what is the right strategy. So we will be working with you. We will be communicating with you the whole way. There is, as I said earlier, it's much better if you're engaged in the process. If everyone's kind of working together, it makes it just far more likely to succeed. And so you would be in the loop discussing with Monash Innovation the whole way. If you have concerns around confidentiality, disclosure, things like that, Monash Innovation is actually the group to help you navigate that. So, for instance, they will be the ones that will help you get non-disclosure agreements in place to make sure that we're not disclosing to other parties and things like that. And they can help you build the strategy around what you're trying to do in terms of commercializing this IP. If it's not protectable, then actually it's probably a conversation you really need to have to work out how are we going to do this. So the short answer is Monash Innovation is under confidentiality. They're under a duty not to go and disclose that publicly.
Thank you, Jordan. Just in the interest of time, we might have to wrap up shortly, but let's wrap up everything. What's the best way to contact yourself, Monash Innovation, going forward to continue or start a conversation?
Yeah, so you can reach out to me via email, just jordan.thurgood@monash.edu. The front door to Monash Innovation is innovation@monash.edu. But if you chat to anyone within your network, if you go and chat to the generator, they can loop you into Monash Innovation as well. So just reach out, have the discussions. But The front door for Monash Innovation is innovation@monash.edu. And if you think you have something, I would encourage you to go to the Invention disclosure form. And again, that'll close the loop and bring you into the Monash Innovation system.
Absolutely. And Helena's just dropped in the chat a really good piece of advice. We are about to launch a program, Researcher to Innovator, which Jordan will be heading up and presenting along with a team of other experts. Do you want to give us a 1-minute summary on that, Jordan?
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of, a very whirlwind talk, but we have a program coming up starting sort of mid-September on Thursdays. It's going to be a couple hours a week. And so far more in-depth information. We're going to be bringing some experts in. We're going to be bringing some investors in at the end of that as well to hear people's projects. So if you're interested in that, I think we can probably put the link in the chat here, but we can probably also send it out to everybody afterwards. But that's called Researcher to Innovator. And if you found any of this interesting, or if you have, which I suspect you probably do, a bunch more questions than we were able to get through, that's going to be a really good program for anyone at that kind of researcher level who's interested in this commercialization, spinning out, licensing, all of that stuff.
Thank you, Jordan. And thank you to everyone that's joined us today. Hopefully it's been insightful for everyone who participated. I know I got a lot out of it. I should mention just quickly, we are running another event next week, Brand Protection with Legiterati. Raquel Garcia will join us to talk through, let's say you are starting up a start out. She's a trademarks and brand attorney, so she'll come in and talk to us about all the ins and outs around protecting your brand, which is very important as a company. So look forward to that from next week. But right now, a big thank you to Jordan and everyone who's joined us. As we mentioned, the contact details are right there in the chat. We have recorded this. We will send out a recording to everyone who registered, and we'll be in touch shortly. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have any more questions, and thank you.
Thanks, Rob.